So hi everyone, I'm Julie, and today I'm going to be talking about smart cities, how they can help us build technological solutions for a more connected, sustainable, and livable future. I wanted to open up with a question to all of you of what are some of the problems that you have with city living? Who's called it out?
Traffic.
Yeah, it's a big one for sure.
Pollution.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Emptiness
That's an interesting point.
of the suburbs.
Okay, yeah, those are all really interesting, and I think that smart cities can help address a lot of those problems, and I'm actually going to be touching on all three of those ideas in the presentation, so that's great to hear. Now, just to kind of give you an idea of what this means, I want you to imagine that you've just woken up, and there's a hot pot of coffee brewing because it was able to track your circadian rhythm and the time of today's sunrise. Now, as you wake up, you go to your washroom, and on the mirror, there's news articles displayed based simply on what you dreamed. Now, you step outside and get in the autonomous vehicle to head to work during the high point of rush hour, but without hitting a single minute of traffic. Once you get to work, a family of cleaning robots brings you that second cup of coffee you didn't even know you needed. However, this is only the smart city that you can see. Behind the scenes, microchips in your body have decided, hey, I think you need to exercise today, and has already signed you up for an evening yoga class, automatically coordinating with the schedules of your friends. And the reason why you're not hearing sirens right now is because a crime map preemptively deployed a police unit to stop a robbery from happening. So this could be a smart city of the future, and as you head to your desk, you greet it, good morning, to which it answers back, hello. So hopefully that just kind of gets your imagination thinking about what these smart cities might actually look like, and will relate to some of the topics in today's presentation. So I'm going to start with some theories and definitions, then go into a positive approach of how smart cities are actually being developed today, what our world currently looks like, also a normative approach of how I suggest smart cities should be developed in the future, and then finishing with some challenges, risks, and solutions, as well as key impacts. So first, just for some context, by 2050, 70% of the global population is expected to live in cities. And this could lead to a problem that was flagged a bit earlier in time by Paul Elkridge, called the population bomb. And this was kind of a fear in the 1950s that the human population was going to grow so quickly that we weren't going to have enough resources to support everyone, which was supposed to have led to a major famine in the 1980s. Now, obviously this didn't happen, and the reason why is because we had technological advancements that made us more productive, so we could make better use of the resources that we have. And I think that going forward, we're going to see a similar challenge where we need to make more efficient use of our resources, and technology is going to enable us to do so. And with that future, as I mentioned, we're going to see that continued scarcity of resources. We're on a planet with limits, but with increased interconnectedness and technology, we're going to be able to resolve some of those issues. Now, some definitions and theories. Obviously, we have to kind of put together what a smart city is. So first, let's think about what it means to be smart or intelligent. We talked about this a lot in class, and one of the papers I was reading, Antoine Picon defines it as the ability to learn, understand, and reason. This aligns with what we heard from Patrick Polarski, where we all brainstormed that intelligence is about taking inputs from your external environment and then using that to think critically and rationally. And a third point that we brought up throughout the class is the idea of, is there a more humanistic side of intelligence? Things like EQ and emotional intelligence that go beyond what machines can understand right now, and is there some innately human aspect that's going to be integrated going forward? Now, going to a city, which is maybe a bit more of a simple definition, but what's interesting to realize here is cities are inherently socialized spaces. There are people, objects, and places are all coming together, and that's going to play a role as we now interject technology into this mix. So putting these two words together, Townsend, who wrote a book called Smart Cities in 2013, defines them as places where information technology is combined with infrastructure, everyday objects, and even our bodies to address social, economic, and environmental problems. An interesting realization here is that our bodies themselves may become integrated with this technology, and with that happening, it raises a question of, are smart cities going to actually be able to understand and anticipate our needs before we even realize it ourselves? That could be an interesting question that leads to that efficiency and optimization that can solve some of the problems that we see in our cities today. And also leads us into a discussion of the technological singularity. As we know, we learned in class the 4 paths to the singularity. So the first being that humans that humans construct a superhuman AI, the second being the path of cybernetics, the meeting of man and machine, the third being that we enhance our natural biological processes to make that superintelligence, and then fourthly, that computers and AI itself is going to be able to create that higher level of intelligence to humans. Now, when thinking about smart cities, the traditional view from these paths aligns with the first one, that humans are currently building infrastructure and technology to make cities more of a sensory being. This means that you can have thousands of sensors out in the city gathering individual data points, and it's things that we can tangibly observe. However, a more futuristic view of smart cities goes with that second path of cybernetics, where cities will actually merge perhaps with our bodies and become more of a sentient being, that meaning that the city itself could have autonomous thought and a sense of consciousness, which I know is kind of weird to think about, but like a lot of things in this class, it's kind of thinking beyond the current limits of what we're used to and what aligns with that first view. So now I'm going to move into kind of what's currently being done today and what smart cities look like right now. So thinking about infrastructure and layout, a really interesting aspect of this is integrated mapping. We see with like really simple apps like the transit app, you can kind of real-time track your city bus. So maps have already evolved to be more than just a static piece of paper. It allows us to interact with the world around us. And a really cool example of this is a project from IBM in Rio de Janeiro called the Smarter Cities Challenge. And what they essentially did was set up a huge command center, which they refer to as the city brain. You can kind of see it in the background here. And what they've done is deployed multiple sensors all over the city, as well as being able to take in individual citizen data points from things like social media. And an example of how this has worked into integrated mapping is in 2012, there was a major fire in a popular shopping mall in Rio. And the algorithms behind this technological AI center actually pulled in images from social media before the fire department was even informed. It then automatically kind of rallied city workers who were close to the area to address the crisis, and within 7 minutes had diverted traffic in a flow to get the most people out of the area as quickly as possible. So this piece of AI was able to analyze multiple alternatives much faster than any human could to give that positive outcome for the actual people existing in that space in the area. And then taking this idea of space and maps one step further, there's an idea of a mirror world and augmented reality, which we're already beginning to see a bit. I'm sure you all know the game Pokemon Go, where things that you do on an app on your phone actually translate to things in the real world. And taking this one step further, it's interesting to think maybe our cities in the future won't even only exist in the physical spaces that we're used to. Perhaps there'll be a digital city that relates to an actual physical city, and then maps will kind of provide that consistent interface between what happens digitally and what happens in our roads and in the spaces that we're used to being in. So when we're looking at how cities are laid out, that could look considerably different in the future, and mapping could be seen kind of as the portal between the digital and physical spaces. Now moving into a second major topic that smart cities can address. Someone mentioned that pollution is a major issue, and I totally agree. So a challenge that we see, kind of as I mentioned, is the rising amount of CO2 and our scarcity of resources to meet our current energy demand for a growing population. And an interesting solution that AI can provide here is smart grids. So again, I'll walk you through it with an example. Right now in Paris, they're distributing these devices called Linky meters to every single energy consumer. And what this lets you do is track your own personalized energy demand. So instead of having to wait for the end of the month to get your energy bill and be like, oh shoot, I've spent a lot this month, you can track that day by day and then kind of mitigate your own personal demand that way. And then these electrical grids can communicate with all of these devices, as well as with other utility services, to optimize the most efficient distribution of resources like electricity and water. Another interesting consideration here is that AI itself can now be seen to be taking on more of a project manager role. What I mean by this is traditionally project managers handle the interactions between humans, but as we go into the future, it's going to be managing both the relationships between humans and systems. So a problem in a lot of cities that already exist, that are trying to transition to be more of a smart city, is that existing infrastructure systems have a lot of difficulty communicating with each other because they were built by different companies from different platforms. It's very hard for them to communicate. But we now see in some cities, AI is able to kind of force those systems to communicate to have this more efficient distribution of resources. So that's what I mean by AI as a project manager. And then for a third area of what smart cities are looking like right now, There's a great quote in an article I read that AI can help convert the social safety net to a social safety network. And this is mainly done by shifting social responses from being reactionary to more preventative. And there's two cool examples of actually what's happening right here in Edmonton to illustrate these concepts. The first of them is the idea of preemptive policing, where IBM has actually partnered with the Edmonton Police Service, and they have a hybrid cloud integration system. What this does is it gathers all of the data points from police people who are like out in the field and out in the city, and then combines this with social media feed, officer notes, and like live news feeds and videos to predict where crimes are going to happen next, and then send more police units out to those areas to do preemptive monitoring to make the community safer and try to stop that crime from happening in the first place. And then as we talked about along this class as well, personalized healthcare becomes a lot easier with the rise of AI. You can have mobile sensors, so just on your cell phone, and also ambient sensors with the roofs in your house. And Infrastructure Canada is working in Edmonton to develop a health data repository, which has been mentioned in previous presentations, is able to take that individual patient's data set, compare it against existing data sets, and get the most optimal and personal healthcare plan for them that can even kind of indicate red flags if something might be going wrong with that patient in times to come. So through doing my research, it was really interesting to learn that right here in our backyard, there's some really world-class projects going on, and Edmonton is in itself on its way to becoming a smart city. So now getting a little bit more conceptual, looking at the normative approach of, but how should smart cities be developed tomorrow? To answer this question, I'm going to ask 4 key questions for 4 key stakeholders. The first of it being governments. So the role of the government is obviously to provide protections for citizens and then create a good regulatory environment to be able to develop the underlying infrastructure and AI technology. What's interesting here is it really depends on the type of government that you have. So in countries like Canada, we're in a Western liberal democracy, governments are quite worried about individual privacy and really protecting that individual. Whereas kind of in other countries, for example in China, there's really an emphasis on creating searchable data. So I'm sure many of you have heard about China's social credit score, where basically it's a digital profile on all of the good things you've done for your community, and then some bad things as well. And the higher your score is, the more access you have to public resources, things like high-speed trains. So with smart cities on the rise, AI is going to help things like that become a lot more of a seamless process. Corporations also play a really important role, and they're currently leading the charge in a lot of smart city development. Countries like IBM, Cisco, Microsoft, Google have invested billions of dollars into building smart cities. However, a concern here that we should keep in mind is that companies will try to find the most profit-maximizing path forward. And what cost does this come at? If you're simply trying to optimize what's happening in a community, are you going to lose that humanistic sense of the community itself? And that's something I'll get into a little bit later. But I think the most important actor in a city is, of course, the citizens themselves. And there's this interesting concept arising called Civic Hackers, where citizens can actually be the main contributors to solutions within smart cities. An example of this, going a little bit back in time, but in the early 2000s in New York, there was someone named Daniel Crowley, and he developed a social app called Dodgeball, which essentially let you interact with the environment around you. So if you were walking down the street and you wanted to rent a house, you could pull up that information about it. Or if you wanted to meet with your friends, you could see on a map where they are. Now, I know a lot of this technology is like pretty commonplace to us nowadays, but back then, this was before the rise of Facebook and any other major social media site. So it showed that citizens were able to identify this technological need before the market realized that there was demand for it. So looking forward, it really is important to value our own human intelligence in finding solutions for social problems that companies might not be the first to pick up on. And then lastly, I think a really important actor to bring up here is the idea of once superhuman AI occurs, how are they going to be involved in this process? As we talked about in this class, it's going to be important for humans to recognize AI as equals and establish that friendly AI relationship, or else we run the risk of AI becoming more intelligent than we are, and then developing cities without fully understanding us. And if AI can't fully understand us, cities might be created that don't have that adequate space and sense of community for humans. So keeping all this in mind, I'm going to argue that there is great importance to a design thinking approach when merging human intelligence and AI intelligence to build smart cities. If you're not familiar, design thinking is basically a process that engages users throughout the entire design, not simply as end users of the cause. And there's 3 steps to design thinking that I'm going to walk through an example that Dr. Solos actually told me about of the buddy bench in the UMA hospital. So the first step to design thinking is defining the problem, which requires a sense of empathy and discovery of needs. So what happened with the buddy bench was members in the hospital would be feeling pretty stressed throughout their day, just rushing through the hallways, and it wasn't a great environment for mental health. To search for a solution, which is the second step, sorry, these are a bit misnumbered here, but for that second step, the idea was maybe if you can create some kind of momentary distraction, that can be a relief on the stress that you're feeling. So then to do that, the third step, conducting user testing, was taken on by the community to think about, is there any way we can transform this bench, which we ordinarily just sit on, to be a more welcoming space and to actually serve a different purpose? And to that effect, as you can see here, objects are placed on this bench, different ones, I guess, at different points of the year, that people can stop, engage with, and start conversation over. So you've transformed a bench, which people normally just sit on, to more of a human experience that solves that issue of feeling stressed. So while this is kind of an example that just hits close to home, I think this approach is also important when we're looking at smart city design, looking at things kind of beyond what their initial, looking for things beyond what their initial purpose may have been, and trying to see if they can serve a greater purpose. And there's some evidence that this works in practice by comparing 2 smart cities that are currently being developed worldwide. The first is the smart city of Songdo in South Korea, and this was quite a corporation-driven project. So Cisco and IBM in total invested $40 billion into this city. The main focus was to make it like a zero-waste, energy-efficient city. However, right now, it's not really being regarded as successful. It only has 25% occupancy, so there's a bunch of empty buildings and some of that emptiness that was mentioned at the beginning. And perhaps this is in part because corporations took a very top-down approach. They were just looking at kind of the amount of money that they could save from this and left out a bit of the human aspect. In contrast to this, there's a smart city called Santander in Spain. And how this project started was they got input from 1,400 local citizens on what problems these people were experiencing in their city, similar to the problem I posed to all of you at the start of this presentation. And then with only an $11 million budget, so a fraction of what the other city was, and a team of 20 researchers, they were able to develop solutions that along the way used something called a user acceptability test. And this was the aspect of design thinking where they were looking at technological solutions and seeing how actual humans responded to them. And as a result, this smart city has been hailed as a great success globally. It's been quoted as being the smartest smart city in the world. So I think it's interesting that it gained that title by innately involving humans in the process and not just relying on the dollars behind it to drive that project. So the final quick part of my presentation, I'll be looking at some challenges, risks, and solutions. One thing that we've also talked a little bit about is the issue of data privacy. So with these millions of data inputs being gathered from individuals, how can we ensure that they're going to be safe? There's an interesting question around if your digital identity is still your personal property. So if sensors are gathering this information about you wherever you go, at what point do you still own that data, and at what point should governments be establishing ethical guidelines for how that can be used? A second interesting issue is how we can help prepare for cyber attacks through AI. So I'm sure, for example, like when your laptop crashes, it's kind of a pain, you have to go get it fixed. Can you imagine if an entire smart city crashed? What kind of dangers that would pose to its citizens? And a really kind of cool concept behind this is being created by a company called Simudyne, where they're able to simulate virtual neighborhoods and then essentially like create disasters within it to see how the AI system would respond. So although AI can pose some of these challenges, AI is also able to be part of the solution by running these simulations in the virtual world before they happen in the real world so that AI and humans together can be better prepared to respond. And then a third challenge is the idea of, could there be a rise of kind of second-class cities? Where I got this idea from was, in my research, it became apparent that it's a lot easier to set up a brand new city and make it smart than to take an existing city like Edmonton and kind of change all of its underlying infrastructure to be smarter. So with that, there's a fear that this could lead to something called the tunneling effect, which I read about in an article. And just to kind of explain what this means, we know that with deep learning and AI, the more data points you feed it, the smarter it becomes. So in a very large city, you're going to have a lot more data points. Therefore, is that large cosmopolitan city going to be able to learn faster, develop faster, and become smarter than cities that are left on the outskirts? Presumably so. So as you can see here, the two green dots represent large cities. And the argument is that those cities would actually be a lot more connected than cities that are geographically close, because their level of intelligence has been skewed by the amount of data inputs they've been able to receive. So going into the future, it's something to be aware of, that if we're going to be able to engineer out inequality in these cities, we need to ensure that these resources are equally available, regardless of population size. So just in summary now, some of the key takeaways from this and some of the arguments that I brought forward are that I think AI, and especially superhuman AI, is going to play a really interesting role if our smart cities exist, only in the physical but also in the virtual space. I also think that partnerships between governments, corporations, citizens, and AI itself is going to be really important to ensure that there's still a place for humans within these cities that we talk about. And then, as I've also spoken to, that design thinking approach is how you can really integrate citizens with that process. So now going back to the question I asked at the beginning, although there's some problems with city living, I think that smart city living can really provide some solutions. To things like pollution, having a smart grid that's able to make energy efficiency a lot better. To issues like traffic, by having autonomous cars that rely on integrative mapping to find the best, most optimal way forward. And then finally to Gary's interesting point about kind of emptiness, and do we have these empty suburban areas? It's a question of if data is collected in concentrated centers, are those areas going to become exponentially more smart? And if so, should we be able to legislate around that to ensure that everyone kind of has equal access and we don't create greater inequality from the cities that we live in? But with that, I hope this sparked some new ideas for you as we think about the physical spaces that we live in with the rise of technology and AI. These are just my image references, and I would love to take any questions.
So we had in, at the beginning, 2050, 70% of the population is going to live in cities, and I think it's expected to be 9 or 10 billion by that point. How is kind of the traffic kind of solved? I know, Uber was expected to reduce traffic and made it worse. And now people are saying with autonomous vehicles, rather than parking, they'll just circle around at 2 miles an hour until their owner is just ready to go. So how does the smart city kind of solve that sort of issue?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think going far enough into the future, it's not simply kind of the distribution of vehicles in a city that will be impacted. It'll be the entire design of cities themselves. So for example, you won't need things like parking lots if autonomous vehicles are able to act in an integrated system. You might not need roads kind of on the ground if vehicles can be transported in other ways. So I think it's a matter of allocating the space we have a lot more efficiently, and then looking at other forms of transportation in the future as well. And just, if you're able to build a brand new city and design it better, like I'm sure we think some roads in Edmonton don't have really an optimal design as the population has grown. But if you're building a city from scratch, then it's a really interesting project for design engineers to just entirely rethink the space that we get from place to place in.
So I have a question. Do you think these smart cities are justified in their costs? I'll give you an example. So like, technology is increasing its capabilities all the time, right? So where we had the first electric cars that came out, like the Nissan Leaf and those very primitive, I guess, so to speak, cars. Now we have Teslas with autonomous driving, right? But the ability and the cost greatly increase over time. So even with your average smartphone, like a phone 5 years ago was nothing comparable to what we have now. So if we scale that same idea up to a city, do you think it's worth investing so much money in a city that might be the city of the future today, but not the city of the future in the future?
That's a really interesting point that you bring, kind of like the city of the future in the future, for sure. I think kind of looking at it through the two lenses of argumentation that I did, the positive and the normative. Right now, companies have been really interested in investing, and I think by 2030, it's expected that there'll be another $125 billion invested in that space. So I do think that companies are seeing the potential and are willing to put their investment behind it right now. How that will change kind of post-singularity in these future of the future cities is obviously a little bit hard to say. It's hard to say, just like even if we're going to view kind of the capitalistic system that we have right now in the same way, if everything is so optimized that citizens kind of have instant access to whatever they want. So it's a tough question that you pose, but I think the point being is that if we want to see this development, we do need to start somewhere. And all of that funding and ideas can't just come from one stakeholder. So that was one of the points that I brought up as well, that I think it'll be important for corporations and governments to really collaborate to share the risk that you mentioned of these developments, while still allowing an innovative ecosystem, because if there's no incentives, then we're probably not going to see that much more change from today, and the cost will scale down over time. Like, an iPhone is no longer like as much as it used to be when you had to buy it brand new. And then I think just the efficiencies within the system are going to help with those cost reductions. So, sorry, just to add on to that, because I thought of it now. Like, especially when some of those things are cost savings in themselves. So like with the linking meter that I mentioned in France, there's obviously an upfront cost of distributing that to every consumer. But it's been analyzed that there is a marginal benefit because the savings that you get from customers using that is greater than the cost of distributing it. So as with any investment, it has to be made responsibly, looking at benefits and costs. But given the investment in this space and the success of cities worldwide, I do think positive progress is being made.
I would like to actually add on to that. I think you can somewhat see a parallel example if you look at subway systems. So for example, I think the New York or Boston subway system is pretty old. When I went to Boston, at least, it wasn't very clean and nice to use, to put it lightly. But when I went to Japan, theirs is like high tech and pristine. It's just real nice. And they might be like 7 decades apart in terms of like technology, but the Boston subway system or the New York subway system is 100% vital to their life and the life of the entire city. So even though, you know, if you look at some place like Japan where they have these maglev trains or whatever that go super fast and their trains are always on time, they never break down, and compare that to somewhere in Boston where, you know, it breaks down all the time. Even if that's the case, the amount of quality of life that's brought by this technology is so great that I think the investment is worthwhile.
Yeah, just kind of responding to that comment as well, I think it's an interesting point that because cities are such a socialized space, you have to look at kind of the fundamental reasons why Japan is really different than places like New York. I think a lot of it does have to do with the cultural human aspect of kind of what people prioritize and what they think is important that they see in their communities. And then that kind of leads to the point that I was talking about with, could this create that second-class city where maybe places like New York are left more behind if it's really difficult to adapt their existing infrastructure? You can go ahead.
Okay, so do you think there's going to be kind of a peak efficiency of how smart a city could be in terms of like the physical infrastructure? Because kind of looking at kind of to make a city truly smart, it should be able to optimize, you know, even its layout depending on what the population trends look like and everything. But it'd be really, really difficult to have a fully modular city. Do you see they're kind of reaching that point, or there just being a limit to the efficiency and how like perfect smart city can actually be?
I think I'm not a superhuman AI, so I don't have the answer to that. I feel like it'd be interesting if, when and if the technological singularity occurs, that AI is able to use our resources in a way that we just like conceptually can't think about right now. So I'm not going to claim to have an answer to that question. In terms of if there's a limit of what we're looking at right now, I think as I mentioned that going back to looking at what citizens actually need is important. Because you can have a city that's like optimized to a T. As I mentioned the example in Seoul, South Korea. Like their buildings are super energy efficient, like I think some of the most energy efficient on the planet. But people don't want to go live in that city. So then, to your point, you can have an optimized city, but if there's no people there, is it really a city at all?
So you can think about smart cities and then the game of Go. You know, before computers were playing Go, there was never any distribution of the pieces on the board that was beautiful and intriguing, right? And similarly, the way we run cities ourselves, there are lots of parts of them that are sort of random. And if you look at traffic and the main functions of the city, you're never struck by how gosh darn beautiful it is. You know, you can imagine that with, you know, computers in charge, the same thing may happen. That suddenly, you know, like in Go, when, you know, computers play, the play is so intriguing and beautiful and beyond human. And so cities could end up the same way when you say, wow, look at that traffic pattern I never imagined, you know?
Yeah, it's really interesting and a good point as well. Like,
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast actually about traffic signals and AI to kind of lead into this. And it was mentioned that like in one city, like the traffic lights were run by 5 different like softwares that couldn't communicate with each other. So that's
Right.
part of why it's so kind of disorganized right now. And I do think that if AI were able to bring that together or just create its own system as you suggest, it would be a lot more appealing for our use.
Right, I'm probably the only person you know who has a traffic light bigger than me sitting beside me in my office, so I
think
should
that's
have
safe to say.
some expertise, yeah.
I mean, the beauty of cities is interesting. If you've been to Paris and you see all the curved streets and how they all lead to each other, you can say that's, you know, whoever thought this up 200 years ago, it's really beautiful, you know, compared to the efficient grid of Edmonton. You did a great job in outlining it, but I guess my fear is it necessarily the case that the really smart city is also going to be a total surveillance environment? Is it necessarily the case?
That's a really good question. It's something I tried to touch on a little bit with like the data privacy issue and the social credit score that China's currently piloting. So I think that again will go back to what a combination of humans and AI are comfortable with and kind of what they agree upon as being the new collective morality. So it's something that we see a lot even today, right? Like a lot of us use like Facebook or other online apps pretty openly. We always just hit okay, like we accept, we'll give you my data. So I think we're seeing a trend where humans are more willing to share the information that they create and provide, but I agree it's a huge question of who's able to responsibly use that information and to what end could that be.
Is that part of the reason that city is only 25% filled? Because people maybe aren't eager to jump into that total surveillance environment?
That's an interesting point. That could definitely be part of it. But just in some things I was reading, there was the comment that people don't want to go there because there's only like one movie theater and it lacks culture. So it seemed to be more on that intrinsically human side, that people weren't going to feel a sense of connection with other humans in that environment. Although I'm sure security was also kind of a thought that was top of mind. If I could just if I could quickly speak to your first point about the design of cities. Something I didn't have time to include in this presentation, but that was super cool and I would recommend you look up, is this guy named Christian Nold has created emotion maps of cities. So if you look one up, it's really cool. It will show a neighborhood, and then he basically sent 100 subjects out into that neighborhood with like emotional sensors on their fingertips. And then when they came back, you can view this map that's basically just people's collections of thoughts of what they saw in that environment. So to be like, oh, I had some lemon ice cream, it was really good. Or like, oh, I wonder what that statue is about. So I think it's kind of that aspect that creates the beauty that you speak of as well. It's not just an infrastructure problem. But yeah, if you want to look it up, it was cool. I had a picture here initially, but then I thought it would be too long.
So you mentioned cybernetics and just finding ways to optimize how we live and kind of like mitigating conflicts. So I was thinking, or I was wondering rather, do you think this technology could be applied towards connecting other smart cities and like preventing conflicts between like current countries that are at conflicts or wars with each other?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the more connected we are, the less conflict we naturally have. Like we see that, for example, in today's day and age with global trade, countries that trade with each other generally engage in war less often because there's a mutual interest. If you have things like data sharing between large cities, and if they're providing that information that leads to intelligence for each other, yeah, I would totally agree with your point. It's probably going to decrease some forms of global conflict. With that, though, comes the question of, are countries and cities going to agree on how that data should be used? And that's kind of an area I think that some problems could arise from.
Can I just add a really quick comment on the 25% population? I think it might be a cultural thing as well. I know at least in China, they have these things called ghost cities where they build these really nice apartment complexes and everything, and the people buy these houses, but they never live in them. They buy it as like I guess like an investment, just buying a house, almost like a bank version.
Right.
So it might be something like that in South Korea. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be investment. Like just kind of from what I read, the biggest question was that people thought it would be lonely, which I thought was interesting. So.
Yeah, you know, in many of these things, it's important to think about kind of an interim condition, and that's not maybe the final point. Like, there can be developments where complete lack of privacy contributes to getting to that point, right? And then beyond there, people may decide that now the most important thing in the next phase is bringing privacy back. And so that could happen. You know, losing these things doesn't mean we've lost them forever, or that it's a one-way, you know, trajectory. Bringing privacy back at some future year could be the coolest idea of that year. And we wouldn't know today how to do that, but it is possible that that could happen.
Yeah, actually, I think all you need in that new city is a few buddy benches.
Sure. That'd do it. Yeah.
I just have two quick questions. So number one is you touched on how these smart cities would solve like inequality. Did you mean everyone would have like equal access to the system, like the smart city? Is that what you meant by it?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways that it can be set up. I think right now a lot of existing inequality that we see is due to systematic barriers of like people not being able to access certain services or being like geographically far away from them. Like we see this kind of with the urban-rural divide, like for example, the difference in quality of healthcare that you can get. So with something like a smart city, if everything is a little bit more instant and just more accessible to where you are, you could kind of engineer out some of those inequalities, I think, just by having open source data, and in that sense, like yes, everyone will have equal access. And then yeah, it's kind of just a matter of how it's distributed.
Okay, my other question is, you said the central brain was like one way a smart city could be designed, but then you also mentioned that would be bad for inequality again because it would be centralized, like they would have more access to data. So is there like a model where there'd be multiple small centers around the city that acted like a big brain? Because like the real one was like one central brain, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So in Rio right now, that's where the city brain is being developed, and it's essentially where all of the inputs from the city are fed into. What I was kind of getting at with like the tunneling effect and the idea that cities will have more information, that's a problem I don't have the answer to because it speaks to the nature of deep learning, where just if you give something increasingly more information, it's going to become smarter. So I'm not quite sure how you could distribute that information because cities with more people are naturally going to collect more data points and have that kind of natural advantage. But it's the idea that there's maybe new types of inequality that we haven't thought about today. Like we're familiar with inequality as we know it human to human right now, but could there be this technological artificial intelligence form of inequality that we're currently not experiencing? I think yes, and I think it's an area that we need to consider.
Okay,